Hello and welcome. I'm Julia Brady. I am a director with Fortuna Admissions, and I'm joined today with Rachel Erickson, and she is also with Fortuna, one of our expert coaches. And we are going to be talking to you today about the interview process, the MBA interview process, with more of an emphasis on Kellogg and Stanford, given the roles that we've played at those institutions. So I am a former managing director of the Kellogg Northwestern Chicago campus. So I oversaw all the operations for the evening, weekend MBA program and worked with some other programs there as well. I happen to have my MBA from Chicago Booth. And have worked with University of Chicago and also have consulted with a number of different MBA programs around the US and actually overseas as well. And if you're not familiar yet with Fortuna, we like to think of ourselves as a dream team of former admissions and MBA leaders from the world's top business schools. So we really work with schools across, across the spectrum, and work with many top candidates. You'll see, our admissions directors include former individuals, former employees from Harvard, Stanford, Wharton, INSEAD, a number of schools. And we'll talk a little bit at the end, again, how you might be able to work with us for consultation, free consultation if you're interested. But our philosophy is partnering with our clients and helping them through the admissions journey, because this is really an important piece of your MBA experience. And we'll both be talking, Rachel and I, about ways that we like to really support our clients and customize our approach for each of them, but also share some tips based on the work that we've done, and also drawing upon the knowledge of, you'll see that array of so many other individuals at Fortuna.
So I'll just quickly introduce myself. As Julia mentioned, I'm Rachel Erickson. I graduated from Stanford Business School in 1998, and I was an admissions interviewer for about 20 years, I would say, on and off. And I also worked in publishing. So those two experiences have really given me the ability to be able to work with people, to help them on their coaching, and to help them come up with their stories, and also, though, guide them in terms of what the schools are looking for and what qualities are really important and impressive in an applicant.
Great. Thanks, Rachel. Well, let's dive into some of the topics, and we're going to have time for questions as well. So feel free to either put things into the comments or chat section. We can address them as they arise, but also we're going to try and leave some time at the end as well. So first, wanted to talk with you about the Kellogg admissions interview process. Kellogg is unique among the top MBA programs, where they tend to offer interviews to virtual every full-time applicant. Now, it's part of the admissions process where the applicant is expected to request the interview, and then in time, you will be matched with an interviewer. So often that is an alum. So Kellogg tends to work with and kind of keep in their circle a number of program alumni that work as kind of contract admissions interviewers. And so they are very closely connected with the school. They have that perspective from their own time there, but also what Kellogg is up to today. The interview tends to run, say, 30 to 60 minutes. And it is what we'd call blind. So the interviewer has seen your resume, but has not reviewed your application. So they are sort of adjacent to the interview team. So as you think about that and say, and given that the interview is a key part of the process and really of any MBA admissions process, but again, unique at Kellogg, where they really do strive to interview every candidate. As you're thinking about it, you really the certain things that you'll want to make sure you convey and that the interviewer will be looking for, I think, is first and foremost fit with the institution. And so as you are going through the application process, and just I think Kellogg is somewhat unique in some of the questions that it asks that really hone in on values. So kind of two aspects of them. One of the key essay questions is when you've created lasting value, and then a second question about your personal values. So really think about ways that you can convey those in the interview, because they're going to be looking at, and especially if you're interviewing with say a second year student or an alumnus, they'll be thinking about how well would you fit with the Kellogg community? Would you be taking advantage of what's there? What are you going to be bringing to the program? In terms of your own sort of skills, personality, interests, the ways that you contribute. And then at the same time, fit goes on the other way. They want to make sure that you really understand Kellogg and sort of this idea of think bravely and advancing bold ideas, doing the right thing, even if there's a personal or social cost to that. So it's very important that, doing the reflection, that you're as authentic as possible. What we've heard from many, again, and Rachel and I both have coached a number of students that have applied across the schools, is it does tend to be often a little more conversational. So being comfortable, authentic, make sure you've done the reflection. And then also, since these are individuals that haven't seen your application, take a look at your essays and other aspects of that, and make sure that those are things you could draw upon as well within the responses. So Rachel, would you like to talk about the GSB process?
Sure. So some of the things are a little bit similar, but some are slightly different. The first thing to know about the Stanford interview is that interview invitations are extended on a rolling basis. So unlike some schools that have one date where they notify everyone whether or not you got an interview, Stanford over a series of weeks sends out a certain number of invitations to applicants each day. And one thing to keep in mind, I know this is a really tough and sometimes stressful way for the school to approach it, but it allows them to really thoroughly read through your application. And then the other thing to keep in mind is that there is no difference between the person who gets an invitation on the first day of the process and the person who gets an invitation on the last day. There's nothing to be read into when you get invited to interview. If you get that interview invite, it is exactly the same. What will happen if you get an interview invite is you will receive an email invitation, which is great news. And once you get that, you're going to be expected to complete the interview in about 7 to 10 days. It's going to be your responsibility to get in touch with the interviewer, to send them an email with your resume, and also to arrange a time for the interviewer to interview you. And one important thing there is to be flexible. So give the interviewer as many options as humanly possible. Give them the option of weekdays and weekends. Make sure that it's something where you work with their schedule and they don't have to work around yours, because you want them to be in a good mood when they interview you and not stressed or worried about trying to fit that interview into their schedule. And then finally, I think this is true for all of the business schools, but interviews are all virtual this year, although historically they were in person. Your interviewer is going to be a GSB alum from somewhere around the world. And because they were historically based in person, the interviewers are typically assigned by location. And even though we are now virtual, it still seems to generally be that your interviewer is someone who is going to be in the same city or the same general geographic area as you. Like Kellogg, it is a blind interview. And so it is really important to know that your interviewer will only ever know your resume. They will know nothing else about you. And at no other point in the admissions process do they get other information other than whether or not you were, what happened and the final decision was with your interview. But at the same time, of course, the admissions committee has access to everything, and your interviewer is going to do a really thorough write-up of your interview, what you discussed, the examples that you talked about, stories that you tell, in addition to their impression. So just make sure that anything that you say during your interview is consistent with what is in your application. It is always good to review your application. You don't want to contradict yourself and have the admissions committee going, what's going on there? I don't understand this now. What happened? So that's something that is important to keep in mind. And then also your interviewer may or may not know your industry or background. And you have to be prepared for a very technical interview where they are asking you really detailed, specific questions, or an interview where you are explaining it at like the very basic level and having to walk your interviewer through exactly what you do and what your company is. In terms of format and length, it's usually about 45 to 60 minutes, but it definitely can run over to as much as 90 minutes. And the Stanford interview, the main part of the first section is behavioral questions, and that is about 30 to 45 minutes. And then the second part is where you have the chance to ask the interviewer about their experiences, and this usually should take about 10 to 15 minutes. And one thing to keep in mind here is that you don't want to ask your interviewer questions that are really specific about classes because they're not necessarily going to know the answer. You want to focus it on their experience and their understanding of the school and things that they would be able to answer, whether they graduated recently or a long time in the past. So just keep that in mind. And now Julia is going to give us a little bit of advice on how you can actually prepare for these interviews.
Yeah. Great. So, as Rachel mentioned, I think I'll kind of pick up on a thread there, that as you'll note, many of these institutions for the interviews are just referring to your resume. So I'd say first and foremost, especially depending where you are in the admissions or in the application process as you're watching this webinar, let's say you're applying to round 2, you've got 2+ months to the deadline, really take some time in preparing your resume, that one-page resume. And so a couple things, make sure that there are some things in there that you can speak to professionally that might elicit some interesting questions about contributions you've made. But also, again, these interviews, as they're looking to establish a personal connection and really get to know the breadth of who you are, spend some time on and making sure that you are developing that other information section of your resume. And including, do you speak another language? Do you have some volunteer commitments? Are you involved in athletics? What are some things that sort of round you out personally that could be good fodder for the interview? But really being prepared to respond to or address anything that comes up on your resume first and foremost. And then next is really, I think just, making sure you get a good list of sample questions. And there are a number that as we work with our candidates with Fortuna, we provide a set of, kind of general, those typical questions about tell me about yourself, how did you choose your career path, those types of things, but also other things as well. In terms of the preparation with, as Rachel noted, these, you can pretty much guarantee that these are all going to be online and that it continues. So that allows you actually to really prepare in a more realistic way. So you can record yourself using an online platform, recommend that you sit down with a friend, or if you have a coach or somebody that you trust that can really put you through the paces, really making sure that you have reviewed a number of different types of questions, that you're prepared, but at the same time, not overly rehearsed. It comes across if somebody is sort of reading from a script. And so you really want to be mindful of that. But at the same time, I encourage clients, I encourage them to think about what are 2 or 3 key things that you might want to make sure come across with you. So a couple things about yourself in terms of your motivations or long-term plans, your values, and what's that theme in terms of your fit, in this case with Kellogg, that you want to make sure that you convey, and have a couple of different ways you can talk about that. So it's kind of similar. So I know Rachel, her background in publishing, I've spent most of my career in marketing, brand management, strategic communications. And so some of these things, and I've also interviewed a number of candidates to join my team. So that preparation is really important and helping connect the dots for the interviewer. So the one kind of final thing in terms of preparation, like I said, the resume is going to be important, but also that sort of doing your homework. And now, again, if we're sitting here a couple of months out from when you might actually be interviewing or submitting your application, spend time engaging with the schools. Spend time, Kellogg in particular really values that you've taken the time to get to know them. So whether it's engaging virtually with a club, attending a class, Kellogg has Kellogg Insight. So it's a great newsletter on their thought leadership, because I sometimes find in the interviews, some of those things can come up more naturally. Oh, when I spoke to so-and-so, or when I sat in on this class, with Professor Kramer, and I learned this about leadership, or when Dean Banks talked about diversity and inclusion and it really spoke to me. Those are things that I think can come across more authentically in an interview that can be sometimes challenging to work into your essays. So really now's that time that as you're preparing holistically, it's actually going to be very helpful in the interview process as well. Okay. And Rachel's going to talk to you about some, more typical questions that may come up.
Sure. So the first thing I wanted to just go over is help you understand a little bit the purpose behind these interview questions, so you have a sense of what they're getting at and why they might be asking the question, so that you know what sort of information is going to be helpful to your interviewer. The first thing is they may just be clarifying questions about your resume. They may just want to understand your job. They may want to just understand your timeline. Those are pretty straightforward, simple, easy to handle. The next thing they want to understand is what motivates you and why you made the choices that you did. That's important to convey during the interview. They also are going to want to know what your interest is in the school and what your rationale for getting an MBA is. And along with that, what is your fit with the school, and how is your personality and your expectations and your interests going to work in that particular community? That's one of the things that they're really looking for, is fit with school. And are you really going to be someone who takes advantage of the opportunity? And then the next thing that they are looking for, and this is with everything, even sometimes a question about something that may seem a little bit off base about an interest or a hobby or an activity, is they are looking to understand how you think, how you analyze things, and how you communicate. So when you are giving answers, you want to try to be clear, you want to be thoughtful, and you also, if you can, you want to be insightful. If you have a really interesting insight or angle or thought, even if it's about something that is an extracurricular, but why it's so important to you, those insights can be really helpful for showing the interviewer how you think, and also really showing how you're going to show up in the classroom. Good communication is very important to business schools because it is a case method. It is, every school uses case method, even if they don't use it exclusively. And in order to contribute in that classroom, you need to be a good communicator and a strong thinker. And then finally, one of the key areas that they're looking at is they're looking for demonstrated leadership experience. And a couple of things to keep in mind here when we're talking about leadership is they're going to be wanting to understand what you did. And by that, I mean you personally, not your team. So in an interview, this is a case where you don't actually want to talk about what we did. You want to talk about what your individual contribution was. They also want to understand how you did it and how you managed to get this past senior management, or how you managed to get everyone else on board with doing this, or how you tackled this incredibly difficult logistical problem and solved it. And then finally, what was the impact of that on your company or your organization? That's really important. They want to understand, are you someone who does have an outsized impact or influence when you are involved? And then the big thing to think about for all of these when you're preparing is thinking about what is unique about you, or what stands out about your contributions that somebody else may not have done, because that's what they're trying to get at. Not just did you do your job and did you do your job as it's expected, but did you do your job in a way that is really special and in a way that somebody else may not have been able to, and that allowed you to accomplish things that someone else may not have been able to. In terms of specific questions, there's sort of the general questions and then the behavioral questions. The general questions focus really on two areas. The first is understanding your background. So the classic walk me through your resume, you should definitely prepare that one because many, many, many people get it. And then also questions like, why did you choose this job, this university, this career path, this major, trying to get at your choices and who you are and what you think about. They may also ask you, what is your role at company X, or what does a typical day look like for you? Once again, they're just trying to really get at your background and understand who you are and what you've done and have a clear sense of that. And then the second set of general questions are usually around your rationale for attending business school. And this also, as Julia mentioned, you're going to want to have really good answers for why do you want an MBA and why do you want to go to this particular school. Keep in mind when you're explaining why you want an MBA that your interviewer at Stanford and Kellogg does not know your career vision. So you are going to have to at least briefly explain what it is you want to do. And then also when you're talking about the school, make sure to be specific and give examples that show that you fit with the school and you fit with their goals and their values and their culture, and that you also really know the school and understand what is special and what is unique about it. You may also get questions like, what do you see yourself doing in 2 to 5 years? If you don't get an MBA, what do you plan to do instead? Or how do you plan to be involved on campus? And all of these are really just to understand why the school is a good fit for you and what you are going to get out of an MBA, and to make sure that that makes sense with what the school's expectations are. And then the behavioral questions. If you've heard about behavioral questions before, you know that they typically start with, tell me about a time when. And when you get a behavioral question, the first thing to know is you may get lots and lots of follow-on questions. And this is supposed to happen. And it is a good thing. Once you hit the follow-on questions, most of the people I work with, they find that the interview gets much easier because you're just having a conversation at that point. And you're not trying to remember anything. You're just answering questions and naturally talking about what you've done. And once again, because this is your experience and these are really specific questions to you, you have all the answers and you don't have to worry so much about what they're going to ask you. You should just be prepared to go with the flow. Also, just be prepared for interruptions. Some interviewers may interrupt you a lot. That's totally fine. They're just trying to understand exactly what's going on and have a really clear picture. And another small thing, if your interviewer is looking down a lot, particularly in a virtual interview, you may not understand this, but they're taking notes. And don't freak out. Don't think they're not paying attention. Don't think they're bored. Don't think they're looking at their phone. They're actually doing the opposite. They're just trying to make sure that they capture everything so that you can get a really good, accurate, thorough write-up submitted to the admissions committee. The two areas that behavioral questions focus on are your accomplishments, your impact, your leadership, and then your challenges. So in terms of accomplishments, a classic question might be, what is something you are proud of? Tell me about a time when you demonstrated leadership. What is your leadership style? Tell me about a time when you worked with a team, or tell me about a time when you worked with a diverse team and what was your impact? Tell me about a time when you identified an issue or a problem or an opportunity, and then what did you do? And this is really your chance to talk about what you have done at work or in your community or in an organization that is great and that is amazing and that has really made a difference. So make sure that you think about those examples ahead of time and take this as your chance to show why you're fantastic and why you should be accepted in business school. And then the other part is sometimes a little bit more difficult for applicants, which is your challenges. And these questions may be, tell me about a time you had to deal with a difficult person or situation. Or tell me about a time when you were blocked from accomplishing a goal. Tell me about a failure you experienced and what did you learn? Or tell me about a time when things just didn't go as planned. And when you are dealing with these types of questions, there are a couple things to keep in mind. The first is, and this is true for any and all interviews, you may not have a perfect answer to the exact question they ask. You might get asked, tell me about a time when you worked with a difficult person. And it might be that your company is great and you actually work with really good people, but maybe your boss had a really challenging situation where a client was demanding something from them and you had to step up to help your boss, meet their needs and solve them. So just explain that to your interviewer and explain that the situation was difficult, even if the people themselves weren't difficult. Another thing to keep in mind is if you eventually succeeded with a challenge, those often make for the best stories to talk about. Those are fantastic. They show that you are not just able to handle the expected and what is pretty straightforward, but you are able to go above and beyond and handle anything that is thrown at you. And if you didn't succeed that time, that is also all right. They understand that you are young and that you are growing. And the main thing to show is what you have learned and how you have grown from a failure or an unsuccessful experience. So, for example, if you had trouble the first time that you managed someone, that's okay to talk about honestly. And then just talk about maybe now how you have been successful in managing people and what you have taken away from that experience and what you have learned. Because once again, business school wants people who are going to learn and who are going to grow through their experience in the classroom. And so they want to see evidence that you have done that and been able to do that in your past life as well. And now Julia is going to talk about some of the tricky, challenging, and unexpected questions that you might get during your interview.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Rachel. Well, I think first and foremost, this is where preparation comes in. So being able to anticipate what those red flags might be. So as you look over, and again, with Kellogg and Stanford are mainly working off your resume. So if there are some sudden job transitions or roles that you didn't hold for a particularly long time, if you have gaps in your resume, if there's something else in terms of the work or other items, other things that you're involved with, make sure that you have a good response to that. Again, what you learned from it, how you kind of took control of the situation. It's very important because really, even at this stage of it, if there's some unexpected or what we might think of trick questions that come up, the interviewer is in some ways seeing how you handle stress, how well you can think on your feet. Again, both in and out of the classroom, things are not always predictable. And as Rachel shared, there's many case instances where there are not clear answers. So really being able to communicate how you think, and when needed, if a question comes up that you weren't quite expecting or that seems a little more difficult to answer, take the time. So just say, wow, that's a good question, to reflect on it. You might even reframe it. And so you take the time to pause and then respond to that kind of question. Some questions like that may come up is, when you may have shared your post-MBA plans, an interviewer could say, well, you actually don't need an MBA for that career path. Why are you getting one? And again, so how would you respond to that? They might ask about, and as Rachel alluded to, just times when you've worked with difficult situations, so a challenging boss or challenging team. So really thinking about, in those situations, how did you manage the situation professionally? How did you move things forward? What did you learn from it? Same thing with if they're probing on weaknesses or failures. Because they're really trying to get that sense of the full picture. Other things that may come up, again, so many schools are focused on sort of building an inclusive culture and advancing equity in many ways. So think about ways that, diversity, equity, and inclusion has been a part of your life. How have you helped others advance? How have you yourself been a part of efforts to create more inclusive workplaces? So that might be another thing that comes up in the interview. Another thing that, again, just in terms of the unexpected is sometimes, again, interviewers might be prone to interrupt a little more. Doesn't signal that they're not interested. They just may want to be getting to a different point and kind of keeping that interview moving forward. They might also have a poker face and be very difficult to read. And again, and these are situations that in some ways they might be recreating what they think is going to come up at times in the classroom. They're really trying to get a sense for this is that one in-person interaction that the admissions team is having with you. So being able to just stay calm, handle sort of manage that stress well. And that's where the ability to practice, to rehearse online, to kind of see how well you manage to maintain eye contact, kind of continue with a positive attitude throughout that. And then, if something comes up and you answered it, and then later in the interview, you're thinking, gosh, I don't like how I answered that question. Feel free to often, towards the end of the interview, there's an opportunity for you to ask questions of them. So definitely be prepared with some good questions and with good relevant questions. As Rachel mentioned, they may have been 10, 20 years out of the classroom. So it might be make sure that it's the types of questions that they're able to answer. But it's also an opportunity towards that end of the interview where you might say, I want to revisit something that you asked about earlier. And I'm not sure I fully expressed the way that this situation played out, but I want to communicate this, and that's okay. So going back again, there is no, they're not looking for perfection. The upside of this whole process is they're really, these top MBA schools are trying to shape a diverse class, different points of view, different perspectives. So again, if you're to get, say, a case interview, that's something that is, how do you think? You may not know, the exact population in China right now or those types of things, but just helping walk through your thought process. They might ask about a topic, again, in terms of, how people reacted to the pandemic. There's a lot of things that might come across as slightly controversial, but how do you respond to that question thoughtfully and sort of share how you can engage with others and how you think, and again, keep calm under pressure. So, and I'll turn it back to Rachel to talk about, again, the virtual interview and tips there.
Yes. So virtual interviews, obviously, we're all pretty familiar with Zoom at this point, but there are a couple of things that are specific when you're doing an interview that are a little bit different than when you may just be having a meeting with your coworkers. And the first thing to keep in mind for all of this is that your goal is to make your virtual interview as much like an in-person interview as possible. You want the interviewer to forget that this is a virtual interview, and you really want the camera and that whole aspect of it to fade in the background and for it just to be about you and the interviewer and the conversation. And then the other thing to keep in mind is that then this is true for in-person and virtual interviews, but you should keep the policy of do no harm at the top of your mind. And by that, what I mean is what is important is for the interviewer to remember what you said and what you were like as a person and not anything else. You do not want them to be talking about, that person's background was really messy or anything other than that conversation and who you are as a person. So the first thing to think about is your setting. And the bare minimum is you have to have a neat, clean, uncluttered background. Do whatever you have to do to move stuff out of the background if you need to. If you're in front of a blank white wall, that is acceptable. That is totally fine. However, I am going to say that in my personal opinion, I think it's really nice when you have an attractive background. It's totally unconscious. It's very subtle, but it is actually kind of pleasant and relaxing for the interviewer when they're looking at something like a nice painting or something behind you, or some attractive pillows on your couch, or just even a bookshelf, but where the books are neatly and nicely organized, and maybe there's a plant or a small sculpture also on the bookshelf. That can be really, really just enjoyable. It makes the interview subconsciously just a little bit easier and a little bit more fun. The next thing, and this is a pet peeve of mine, is camera angle and your face in the frame. You don't want to be really, 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 really close to the camera. And it is very important, I think, not to have that weird angle where they see the ceiling and they can see your chin. It's a very unnatural angle, and it makes it hard for the interviewer to see you fully. They're kind of looking at you at a weird angle, and it throws things off. And then last but not least, of course, is try to not have any distractions, such as the phone ringing. I apologize for that earlier. But if it does happen, you just apologize, you move on, you deal with it. People understand that these things happen. We've all seen the videos where the kid wanders into the room during an important television interview. Just handle it naturally. Your interviewer will understand, and it's how you cope with setbacks, not that the setback happened.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of your person and your attire, once again here, the main thing is that your interviewer should remember you and what you said, not what you're wearing, not your hair, not your accessories, anything like that. I always say better safe than sorry. You can never go wrong with a jacket and tie for men, or a jacket and a nice blouse for women. And I will also say that if you know your industry and you know your interviewer's industry and you feel comfortable with something slightly less formal, you can do that. That is really, though, something that should be up to your discretion and judgment, but you are never going to get points taken off of you for showing up formally dressed to an interview. I also want to keep in mind, it doesn't matter how nice what you're wearing is. Nobody cares whether your jacket is a fancy, expensive brand name jacket or just a simple, straightforward, basic jacket. It is about showing that you understand what professional attire is. It is not about impressing the interviewer. I actually think understated and simple and not over the top fancy is what I've seen in 90% of my interviews. Mm-hmm. And what I expect and I'm comfortable with. The occasional time when I've seen somebody in like a very nice suit, they were somebody who worked at a company that sold men's clothing. So there was a little bit of an expectation in that case that you do know how to dress. If you're in a fashion industry, for example, then once again, still those people usually dress traditionally and classically, but they just do a nice version of traditional and classic. Accessories should follow the same rule. Really focus on being unobtrusive and subtle. You don't want somebody remembering your accessories. You want them remembering what you said. Face and hair, neat, tidy, clean. That's really the important things there. You can wear your hair back in a ponytail if you're a woman. You can have a beard or be clean shaven as a man, but it should be neat and it should be tidy, and it should, if you haven't gotten a trim, try to trim your hair, even if you have to do it yourself, just to make sure that you do present a clean appearance and look like you've taken the time and really thought and care about presenting your best foot forward. And this is a subtle thing, but if you are someone who alternates between contacts and glasses, on a virtual interview, I find sometimes that the glare from glasses, if it's not a big deal, but if you do wear contacts, then maybe wear contacts for the interview. This is never an issue in person, but on a virtual interview, it can sometimes be a problem. But the most important thing is that you are able to see the interviewer and read and understand their expression and body language. So please, if you don't wear contacts and you are blind, don't take your glasses off just to have the glare. It's, once again, these are tiny, tiny things at the margin that you can think about. And then the next thing to think about is posture, eye contact, and your speaking. Good posture is really important. Make sure that you are sitting up straight, you look comfortable and relaxed. Make eye contact as much as possible. Figure out where on your computer the camera is and where you have to look in order to make it look like you are looking at the person. Hopefully that will be actually looking at the person, but if you're on an iPad, for example, sometimes it's not. And so you want to adjust for that and make sure that it looks like you're making really good eye contact. And then finally, in your speaking, don't mumble, speak up, speak clearly, make sure you're easy to understand. And then the last thing to think about is just your technology, because you don't want anything to go wrong. Try to have good Wi-Fi. But once again, understand that your interviewer knows that not everybody can control every situation. One thing that you can control, though, is your lighting and your sound. And if you do not have good lighting or you do not have a great microphone already, invest in the money, buy a ring light, which is just a really simple, inexpensive light that you can buy that you clip on the top of your computer and or on top of your monitor, and it helps give you light so that the interviewer can really see your face and see your expressions. And then make sure that you buy a good microphone if you don't have one already, or wear a headphone that provides good sound if you haven't done that, because the most important thing out of everything is that you don't want the interviewer to have to struggle to understand what you are saying. If you had to do an interview 100% audio because power went out in your house, you could get by with doing that, but obviously you have it's really fundamentally about what you say that's important. And then last but not least, make sure your device is charged and make sure you have a backup plan if any of these things do go wrong. So I hope that this advice has been helpful, and Julia and I are now available to answer any questions that you have. And you can also sign up if you have more specific questions and want in-depth feedback. You could sign up for a free consultation at Fortuna.
Great.
Any questions from the audience? One thing that I do see in the chat that I will just reiterate, I did mention it, but the question was about when does Stanford release their interviews? And I want to reiterate that there really is no difference between the person who gets the interview the first week and the person who gets the interview the very last day. I have had fantastic, incredibly good candidates where it was so last minute that they were actually, emailing me the next day saying, hey, can we just get a heads up, thumbs up or thumbs down, because we're trying to make our decisions. So, and this person, amazing candidates. So just know that that doesn't matter. If you get that invite, it is completely a level playing field. And it's really just when they're reviewing the applications, not about which applications are better and more likely to get in.
Mm-hmm. Great. And I see the question about the interview with the Kellogg Admissions Committee. So for the most part, again, they will typically just have seen your resume. And so really spend a lot of time, make that your focus. There likely won't be probing questions about your actual application. And there's going to be a lot to cover just within the resume. But I think, again, as you think about preparing for Kellogg, and really this goes for many of the schools, they're not looking for perfection. They are really trying to assess fit and also your level of interest in the school. So really, not just doing the homework on your resume and those stories, but also truly understanding, taking the time now to know Kellogg and being able to bring up some aspects about the academic experience that you're interested in, maybe some of the student clubs, maybe there's alums that you follow. So that is all going to really help your preparation.
And I just want to jump in on something Julia was saying, which is about this looking for perfection, because I saw this time and time again when I interviewed people. Somebody might be really nervous at the beginning of the interview. Sometimes their voices were a little shaky. That was pretty normal and pretty expected. And what usually happened was as the interview went on, they got more comfortable, they got more relaxed, and we were able to really have a conversation. The same thing with sometimes people will not give the right answer to a question. Maybe they're not quite sure what I'm asking for, and they give an answer that doesn't exactly hit what I want. But I will ask a follow-on question. It is my job as an interviewer to ask the information I need to get the answers I need. So if you don't, you understand, like I ask you something and maybe I ask you something you're proud of and you give a very personal answer. That's great. That's a really good answer. That's a very honest answer. And if there's more information that I need about a particular skill that you have, then I'm going to ask a different question to get on that. And it's about showing that you have enough strengths and that you are a good enough candidate to really contribute and be a great addition to the class. It's not about being perfect as an interviewee. And I think that's something just so you don't get panicked or worry if you feel like, oh, I really didn't answer that question that well. It's fine. You have a long time to talk to them, and they are looking at the whole interview. The whole, the decision is made within the first 2 minutes is completely not true for these interviews. Every single question and the entire interview is important, and you can really grow and evolve and change your interviewers' understanding of you and your importance to the class during the course of the interview.
Absolutely. And I was part of a session last year where there were a number of current admissions committee members. And, one made the great point of, our title is We Work in Admissions. So we're really looking for the positive and reasons why we should admit you, not why we should disqualify you. So, these are not adversarial. These are folks that are truly interested in getting to know you and understand what you would bring to their program. And I saw a question from Mafalda about really justifying or sort of the different degrees, an undergrad degree in marketing and master's degree in management. And I think if you've had different backgrounds like that, and again, those are different areas of the business spectrum, I think that that part of it is just making sure that you have a good story for how you selected those and how those, both in terms of your own interests, personal interests, as well as professional interest, and how those degrees have prepared you for the path that you're on. So again, really thinking about, even if as you look in your background and maybe something like, okay, I had this major, I didn't like it. I ended up changing majors late in my undergraduate career. How's that going to look? Focus on the why. Again, how you grew personally, how you made that decision, and how you came out better for it. Again, even these things that maybe didn't always go as planned, whether it's you had to take a pause during your studies, had to leave a job sooner than you thought, switch majors. Those are all things that were opportunities for learning and growth. So not something to worry about, just something to reflect upon and how that was meaningful to you.
I agree. And I think that sometimes people who have very different backgrounds, it actually shows different facets of them. And that's something that can be a great thing. People who are doing this understand that people have a lot of different interests, and they may have a lot of different areas that they might potentially want to explore. And so if you've made a pretty drastic career switch, or you've done something that is very different, a lot of times you might find that later on in your life and later on in your career, these very disparate experiences come together in a really nice, neat way and build on each other in very unexpected and serendipitous ways. Julia, I'm sure you know this also from your work experience. You never know
Absolutely.
what is going to end up being really precious and valuable.
I sometimes joke that, my career path makes so much more sense in reverse. I never would have envisioned where I was today, but that sometime, as a brand manager on Gatorade at that time, where I was working closely with the University of North Carolina on some health initiatives for, it was a program called Get Kids in Action, that started to really spark my interest in working with universities. And yet the brand management experience I had then helped me when I was guiding universities to tell their stories better. And again, and helped me in terms of, and in the admissions process, having been a manager in different types of organizations. So these are all your experiences help shape where you are today. And they recognize that you're still early in your career. And that's where it's an opportunity. How are you going to learn and grow, and how that the MBA is going to push you personally as well as professionally.
Sure.
Yeah.
I see a couple of other questions about failure and ethical dilemmas. So I'm going to say Stanford, it would be pretty unusual to get the ethical dilemma question. That's not a normal one. The failure question you definitely might get. And I talked about this a little bit, but the important thing to explain is In the best case scenario, you eventually resolve the failure. You figured out a solution, or you at a later point were able to turn that failure into a success. That is the ideal scenario. And you then just want to talk about how that happened. But you do want it to be a real failure. You don't want to be like, oh, well, I was working so hard and doing so much that my boss told me to take it easy. Like you want to show a real growth there. And then if you really are still struggling with this issue, make sure that you have at least shown significant progress and growth in this area. And then sometimes maybe it's just a terrible situation and there was no way to make it better. It's okay to be honest about that, but then just show what you have done. Maybe you changed jobs in order to, that you are aware enough to recognize what you can fix, what you can solve, what you can affect, and then times when you are not going to be effective and you need to change situations. And then Julia, do you have any suggestions for the ethical dilemma?
Yeah, and it may be less of an ethical dilemma. Where I've seen this, where it might come up, is just when you've had to kind of take a position that maybe wasn't popular or might have come at some personal cost, but it was the right thing to do. And so how did you help bring others along in that decision? How did you, again, and this may be if you were in a, say, toxic work environment and you decided to leave, how did you maintain personal integrity? And I think, again, it may not be framed as ethical dilemma, but the values that guide you and the actions that you take, as opposed to just, espoused or professed values, but really lived values, that's something Kellogg is incredibly interested in. And what I've seen as well, again, benefit of when I was working at the institution, I spent a lot of time in the classroom as well, getting to know the faculty and the students, and just the people were willing to share their experiences. And that's part of this Kellogg ethos of kind of think bravely. It's also live bravely. So, reflect on those moments where you've maybe had to do a difficult thing, but it was the right thing and why it was.
And then what weaknesses can be mentioned when you're asked about that? You don't want to be too honest, but you should be honest. Once again, don't say, oh, I'm just such a perfectionist. Once again, go back to that growth and think about an area where you have grown, where you still want to grow further. And also think about it in context of business school and particular things that you want to learn in business school, because that's then a great justification for why you want an MBA, is to address some of those weaknesses and learn those skills. And I think the aim of asking the question is partially self-awareness, and they want to know that you understand yourself, that you are thoughtful, that, part of it is, can you handle a difficult question? And secondly, and say something that is meaningful and real without, sort of opening your kimono and sharing everything. And at the same time, that's not trite. And then also they just want to get a sense of what your real strengths and weaknesses are.
Yeah. And things, and, mentioning weaknesses that you have worked on. And so it's something that, again, how you maybe addressed it in that situation, but if it's an area that you needed to work on, but at the same time, really think about if it's something that might give them pause. So if you have struggled quantitatively repeatedly with anything that if you're working on that and you're doing those things, that's good on your own time. So make sure that these are areas that the weaknesses that again are broadly applicable. So it might be something, I know sometimes people struggle with overcommitting. It might even be, setting boundaries that professionally. And I think that's something that we've all struggled with during COVID, and that kind of always on. The computer's always right there. I saw a great New Yorker cartoon where there's a husband and wife in like a living room, and he's at a computer, and he asked the question, I can't remember, do I work from home or do I live at work? So think about these things that others have struggled with and how you take handle of it.
And once again, you can also interpret the question to be things that you have not been able to do yet or still need to grow. So maybe you've never had accounting, you've worked in sort of a more creative field, so you don't know the financial or finance or accounting very well. That can be a weakness. But it's not, it's obviously something that can be addressed. And sometimes things like that can be effective.
Yeah. And Rachel, actually, I think, and just working with a candidate recently, who has a number of years of work experience, but not as much direct management experience. So he was concerned about some of the leadership questions. And he's like, well, I wasn't, they might say, well, you didn't have direct reports or you haven't managed a big team. And as we talked through it, based on the work he's done, he has actually managed a number of people, non-direct reports. So think about that in terms of the leadership and managerial skills questions that come up. Don't fret if you haven't managed an exact, a specific number of team members, because you probably have a lot more leadership experience than you realize, and managing people in different functions up and down the organization. So those are all going to be important things. I know we are about out of time, so just do want to, again, encourage any of you that might be interested to reach out to fortunaadmissions.com. We provide a free consultation that just really will help determine your potential fit with our organization. I know the link on the screen shows specifically our MBA interview prep, but we work with a number of candidates end to end. Again, one of the things that I like most about Fortuna is the way that we really flexibly structure our engagements. And so if it's something that you want to focus on interview prep, or let's just say essay prep, we'll do that. And I think, we all do this because we're passionate about the MBA experience. We had great experience, both as many of us have our MBAs, but also have worked with the institutions. So helping shape that future class is really meaningful to us. So I think as you would learn that, again, we work well as a team. So if you decide to work with Rachel or I, there are dozens of other Fortuna folks that we are tapping on for insights on other things. And I think that really comes through in the work that we do.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone who's joined us today. And we hope that we have been able to give you a little bit of a sense of what the interview process is like at these schools, and hopefully make it a little bit less daunting, because at the end of the day, it's a great opportunity for you to share who you are with your interviewer and help show them why you are a great fit for that school.
Absolutely. Yes. Well, thank you for joining us today. Thanks for the opportunity, and best wishes moving forward.